Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever believed with all your heart that you were right only to discover later that one unexpected moment could change everything? Stay with me until the very end, because what I am about to share is not a story about losing an argument. It is a story about how pride can blind a person, how one quiet voice can shake years of certainty, and how a single courtroom became the place where my entire life changed forever. We also want to know where you're watching from today. Leave your country and city in the comments, because we read them with gratitude, and we always enjoy seeing how people from all over the world come together to hear stories of faith, hope, and transformation. Now, listen to the testimony. The sound of the wooden gavel echoed across the courtroom before I even realized my own hand had been shaking. Papers were scattered across my desk, but I barely noticed them. Every eye in that courtroom was fixed on the 12-year-old girl standing alone near Thewitness stand. Her hands held a worn Bible so tightly that her fingers had turned pale. She looked frightened, yet strangely peaceful. I remember exchanging confident smiles with the other 3 judges seated beside me. We had already discussed the matter privately before entering the courtroom. In our minds, the hearing was nothing more than a formality. We believed the girl would become nervous, stumble over her words, and quietly accept the judgment we intended to deliver. We had handled hundreds of difficult cases before. This one, we believed, would be among the easiest. My name is Judge Kareem Hassan. At that time, I was 58 years old, living at 118 Al-Noor Street in the fictional city of Dar al-Hayat. For nearly 30 years, I had served in the courts with a reputation for discipline, intelligence, and absolute confidence in my own understanding of truth. Many people respected me, others feared me, few dared to question me. My fellow judges often sought my opinion before making difficult decisions because they believed my reasoning was impossible to defeat. I secretly enjoyed that reputation more than I should have. Looking back now, I realized that pride had quietly become part of my identity without me even noticing. The case before us had already attracted attention across the city. News reporters crowded outside the courthouse. Local residents filled every public seat inside the courtroom long before the hearing began. Rumors spread quickly that a young Christian girl had boldly refused to deny her faith despite intense public pressure. Some said she was stubborn, others said she was brave. Many expected the hearing to end within minutes. Almost everyone believed she would leave in tears. Even I believed that. As I glanced toward her, I noticed something unusual. She was not looking at the audience. She was not looking at the lawyers. She was not even looking at us. Instead, her eyes remained quietly lowered, as though she was praying in complete silence. That bothered me more than I expected. I had seen many frightened people in court. Fear usually revealed itself through restless hands, trembling voices, and desperate expressions. But this girl carried herself differently. She seemed afraid, yes, but not defeated. It was as if she believed someone unseen was standing beside her. I leaned slightly toward Judge Farid, who sat on my left, and whispered that this would not take long. He smiled and quietly nodded. Judge Sulman adjusted his glasses, while Judge Nabil organized the documents before him. Everything appeared perfectly under control. We believed we understood exactly how the next hour would unfold. Then something happened that I have never forgotten. Before the hearing officially began, I happened to notice an elderly woman seated near the back of the courtroom. Her clothes were simple. Her face carried the marks of many difficult years. She never looked toward us. Instead, she watched only the young girl. I expected to see panic in her eyes, but instead I saw complete peace. She gently smiled at the child, as if silently reminding her not to be afraid. The girl looked back for only a brief moment and returned the smallest smile before facing us again. I cannot explain why that simple exchange unsettled me. Something inside me whispered that this hearing might not unfold the way any of us expected. I quickly pushed the thought aside. The clerk called the courtroom to order. Everyone stood. The doors slowly closed behind the final spectator. The silence became so heavy that even the smallest movement echoed through the room. As I reached for the gavel, believing it was about to begin an ordinary hearing, I had no idea that before the day ended, I would walk out of that same courtroom carrying questions that would haunt every quiet night of my life. And those questions began the moment the little girl finally lifted her eyes and looked directly at me. When the hearing officially began, I looked directly at the young girl and spoke with the confidence that had followed me throughout my career. "State your name for the record," I said in a calm voice. She lifted her head without hesitation and answered, My name is Hannah Williams. I am 12 years old and I live with my grandmother at 24 Cedar Lane, Brookhaven. Her voice was soft, yet every word carried through the courtroom as if the silence itself was helping her speak. The clerk finished writing her statement while reporters leaned forward, ready to capture every moment. I studied her carefully, expecting her confidence to fade now that the questions would become difficult. Instead, she simply stood there with both hands resting on her worn Bible, taking slow breaths as though she had already prepared her heart for whatever would happen next. That unusual calm disturbed me more than I cared to admit. I had questioned hardened criminals, powerful businessmen, and respected community leaders who appeared far more nervous than this child. Judge Farid began the questioning first. His tone was polite, but everyone could hear the challenge hidden beneath his words. He asked Hannah why she refused to stop speaking publicly about Jesus when Sheikh knew it had brought criticism upon her family and drawn unwanted attention throughout the city. She quietly explained that she was not trying to offend anyone or start arguments. She simply believed that hiding what God had done in her life would be dishonest. Several people in the audience exchanged confused looks because her answer contained no anger, no accusation, and no attempt to defend herself. Judge Salman leaned forward and asked whether she believed everyone else in the courtroom was wrong. Once again, she answered with surprising gentleness, saying that judging hearts belonged to God alone, but she could not deny what she personally believed to be true. I noticed one of the reporters slowly lowered his camera. Even he seemed caught off guard by the kindness in her voice. As the questions continued, I became determined to expose what I believed were weaknesses in her understanding. I had spent decades studying law, religion, and history. Surely a 12-year-old child could not withstand careful examination. I adjusted my glasses and began asking her about faith, truth, and certainty, expecting her to hesitate. Instead, every answer came after a brief pause as though she first searched her heart before speaking. She never rushed. She never argued. She never insulted any of us. That frustrated me because I had prepared myself to confront someone who would become emotional or defensive. Instead, I found myself facing someone who answered difficult questions with remarkable peace. I glanced toward my fellow judges and that even their confident expressions had begun to change. None of us said it aloud, but we were beginning to realize that this hearing was no longer following the path we had expected. Then an unexpected interruption changed the atmosphere completely. A loud voice suddenly came from the back of the courtroom as one man stood to his feet and accused Hannah of deceiving people with childish stories. Court officers immediately moved toward him, but before they reached him, Hannah quietly turned in his direction. Everyone expected fear to appear on her face. Instead, there was only sadness. She did not answer his accusation. She did not argue with him. She simply lowered her head for a brief moment, as though silently praying for him. The man who had shouted suddenly became quiet, almost embarrassed by his own outburst, and slowly sat back down without another word. A strange silence settled across the courtroom. I had witnessed many heated hearings, but I had never seen anger disappear so quickly without anyone raising their voice. Something inside me became deeply unsettled, although I refused to show it. I told myself that this was only the beginning, and that sooner or later the child would contradict herself. Yet as I looked into Hannah's eyes, I felt an unfamiliar question rising inside my own heart. Why was someone so young standing with such courage, while 4 experienced judges, including myself, were becoming increasingly uncomfortable? I did not yet understand that the most important moment of the day had not even happened. Within the next few minutes, Hannah would answer one simple question, and those words would follow me home, keep me awake through countless nights, and begin a journey that would eventually change everything I believed about truth, pride, forgiveness, and the God I had spent years refusing to know. I cleared my throat and leaned forward, determined to regain control of the hearing before it slipped further from our hands. Looking directly at Hannah, I asked the question I believed would finally expose the weakness in her faith. "You keep saying you trust God completely," I said. "If that is true, why would your God allow a 12-year-old girl to stand alone in a courtroom filled with people who disagree with her?" The courtroom became so quiet that I could hear the ticking clock on the far. Well, every reporter stopped writing. Even the lawyers lowered their heads waiting for her response. Hannah did not answer immediately. She gently placed one hand over her Bible, took a slow breath, and looked around the courtroom before her eyes rested on me again. There was no fear in her face, only compassion that I could not understand. She softly explained that she did not believe she was standing there alone, because throughout the difficult weeks leading to the hearing, the Lord had continued to strengthen her heart. She said he had let her know that courage was not the absence of fear, but choosing to trust him while afraid. Then she quietly added that perhaps the reason she had been brought into that courtroom was not because God wanted to change her mind, but because he wanted to touch someone else's heart. Those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket, and for reasons I could not explain, I suddenly found it difficult to look her in the eyes. Before anyone could speak, memories I had buried years earlier unexpectedly flooded my mind. I remembered my childhood home, where my father often reminded me that truth should never fear honest questions. I remembered the elderly Christian neighbor who had once helped my mother after she became seriously ill without asking for anything in return. I remembered dismissing his kindness because I believed his faith was misguided. Those forgotten moments returned all at once, and I found myself wondering why they had suddenly become so vivid. I quickly pushed the thoughts aside and reminded myself that I was a judge, not a man searching for answers. My responsibility was to remain objective, yet something deep inside me was beginning to crack. I noticed Judge Nabal quietly shifting in his chair, while Judge Farouk stared at the papers before him without turning a single page. None of us spoke, but I sensed that each of us was wrestling with thoughts we had not expected to face that morning. Trying to recover the direction of the hearing, I asked Hannah another question. If people reject what you believe, I said, do you think God will reject them too? Several people in the audience nodded, expecting her to give a harsh answer that would justify our doubts about her message. Instead, she slowly shook her head and explained that God had shown his love by giving people the opportunity to seek him freely, rather than forcing anyone to believe. She admitted that she did not have answers to every difficult question, but she believed that pride often prevented people from recognizing the truth standing right in front of them. She spoke with such humility that no one could accuse her of arrogance. Her words were simple enough for a child to understand, yet they carried a weight that none of us could easily dismiss. For the first time in my years on the bench, I realized I was no longer examining the witness. Somehow, without intending it, the witness had begun examining my own heart. Then an unexpected sound broke the silence. It came from the public gallery, where the elderly woman I had noticed earlier quietly began weeping. She made no attempt to interrupt the hearing, but tears streamed down her face as she clasped her hands together. Hannah glanced toward her grandmother with a gentle smile before returning her attention to us. That single glance revealed something powerful. It told me this child had already counted the cost of her faith long before entering the courtroom. She was not trying to win applause or prove she was better than anyone else. She simply refused to deny what she believed God had done in her life. The atmosphere inside the courtroom changed so noticeably that even the officers standing near the doors exchanged uncertain looks. I had entered that room expecting to oversee a routine hearing, yet it now felt as though every person present was silently confronting questions they had avoided for years. As I looked at the three judges seated beside me, I realized something had happened that none of us could deny. Our prepared arguments no longer seemed as convincing as they had only an hour earlier. The confidence we had carried into the courtroom had quietly begun to disappear, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that truth is not always defiated by greater knowledge or louder voices. Sometimes it stands calmly in the heart of a frightened child who refuses to hate those questioning her. I still did not know where this hearing would end, but one thing had become painfully clear to me. Hannah had not come to that courtroom merely to defend her faith. Somehow, in ways I could not yet understand, her presence was exposing the pride that had ruled my own heart for decades, and I could feel that the hardest part of my journey was beginning. The chief clerk quietly handed me another document, reminding me that several questions still remained before the hearing could conclude. I nodded, but my confidence was no longer the same. Looking across the courtroom, I saw that every face was fixed on Hannah. No one whispered. No one shuffled papers. Even the reporters seemed to have forgotten their deadlines. I asked her one final question that I believed would settle the matter once and for all. If everything you believe is true, I said, what would you say to 4 judges who have spent their lives convinced that you are mistaken? The question hung in the air for several long seconds. Hannah looked at each of us one by one. There was no anger in her expression, and no desire to embarrass us before the crowd. She slowly explained that if she truly believed God loved every person, then that love had to include the 4 judges sitting before her. She said she could never celebrate if someone rejected God because her deepest hope was that every person would come to know His mercy. Then she quietly admitted that she had prayed for us every night since learning who would preside over the hearing. I felt my heart skip a beat. We had spent days preparing questions to challenge her faith, while she had spent those same days praying for us. Her unexpected confession left the courtroom completely still. I looked toward Judge Farid, expecting him to continue the questioning, but he remained motionless, staring at the desk before him. Judge Sulman slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, something I had never seen him do during an official hearing. Judge Nabil shifted uneasily in his chair and reached for his glass of water, but his hand trembled so much that he placed it back on the table untouched. I suddenly became aware of my own breathing. My carefully prepared arguments no longer seemed important. Instead, one painful thought kept returning to my mind. Why would a child pray for people who had openly questioned and criticized her? It was easier for me to understand revenge than forgiveness. Yet standing before us was someone who seemed to believe that love was stronger than both fear and resentment. That realization unsettled me more deeply than any argument ever could. As the silence stretched across the room, another memory surfaced without warning. Many years earlier, when I was still a young lawyer, my mother had once encouraged me never to allow knowledge to make my heart hard. She believed that wisdom without compassion eventually becomes pride. At the time, I dismissed her words as emotional advice from a loving parent who did not understand the demands of the legal profession. After she passed away, I rarely thought about that conversation again. But now, while listening to this 12-year-old girl speak with humility instead of bitterness, my mother's words echoed inside my mind with unusual clarity. I began asking myself questions that I had avoided for decades. Had my pursuit of justice slowly robbed me of mercy? Had my desire to always appear correct prevented me from honestly examining my own heart? Those questions frightened me because, for the first time in many years, I could not immediately answer them. Without planning to do so, I looked directly at Hannah and asked what gave her such peace when she knew the outcome of the hearing might not favor her. She smiled gently before lowering her eyes for a brief moment. Then she explained that during many nights of fear, as she prayed alone with her grandmother, the Lord had continued to comfort her heart. She said He had revealed to her that obedience was more important than popularity, and that faithfulness mattered even when circumstances seemed impossible. She admitted that she had cried many times before entering the courtroom and that she was still afraid, but she had chosen to trust God instead of allowing fear to decide her future. As she finished speaking, I noticed tears quietly running down the face of the elderly bailiff standing near the courtroom door. He quickly wiped them away, hoping no one had seen, but I had. At that moment, I realized something remarkable was happening. The atmosphere had changed so completely that no one seemed interested in winning an argument anymore. Instead, every person present appeared to be searching their own heart. I closed the file before me, even though several pages remained unread. None of us had expected the hearing to unfold this way. We believed we were evaluating the faith of a frightened child, yet somehow her quiet courage had exposed the pride hidden within each of us. I could not explain it then, and I certainly could not admit it publicly, but I walked out of that courtroom carrying a burden I had never known before. Hannah's words refused to leave my thoughts, and that night, for the first time in my life, I found myself unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered her saying that she had been praying for us. I did not yet realize it, but the battle had moved from the courtroom into my own heart, and the decision that would shape the rest of my life was drawing closer than I could possibly imagine. That evening, I returned to my home at 118 Al-Noor Street, long after the sun had disappeared behind the hills surrounding Dar al-Hayat. Normally, after an important hearing, I would review my notes, prepare for the next day's schedule, and sleep peacefully, convinced that justice had been served. But that night was different. I loosened my tie, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat alone in the living room with the courtroom file resting on the table before me. I opened it several times, hoping the written statements would quiet the questions racing through my mind. Instead, every page reminded me of Hannah's calm face and the unexpected kindness she had shown toward the very people examining her. Her words echoed repeatedly in my thoughts. She had not spoken with hatred. She had not tried to humiliate us. She had simply said she had been praying for us. I could not understand why those few words carried such weight. I had spent decades believing that strength came from winning debates, yet that young girl had accomplished something no experienced lawyer had ever done. She had left me questioning myself without raising her voice even once. Around midnight, I walked into my study, a room filled with hundreds of books collected throughout my career. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, containing volumes on law, history, philosophy, and religion. For years, I had taken pride in that collection, believing knowledge alone could answer every important question. As I slowly scanned the shelves, my eyes stopped on a dusty Bible that had been given to me nearly 20 years earlier by an elderly Christian professor after we had participated in a legal conference together. I had accepted it only out of courtesy and placed it on the shelf without ever opening it. That night, for reasons I could not explain, I reached for it. Dust covered the cover, as though reminding me how long it had been ignored. I held it in my hands for several moments before carefully opening the first pages. I was not searching for conversion. I was searching for understanding. Somewhere deep inside me, curiosity had begun replacing certainty, and that frightened me more than I wanted to admit. As I quietly read, the house around me became completely silent. Hours passed without my noticing the time. Some passages challenged me, while others stirred questions I had never seriously considered before. I found myself comparing what I was reading with the compassion I had witnessed in Hannah's life. Suddenly, her courage made more sense than it had inside the courtroom. It did not appear to come from self-confidence or stubbornness. It seemed to come from a relationship with God that gave her peace even while facing public pressure. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I felt an unusual conviction settling over my heart. It was not the feeling of losing an argument. It was the painful realization that I had spent many years evaluating other people's beliefs without honestly examining my own. In the quietness of that room, I sensed that God was patiently drawing my attention toward truths I had ignored for most of my life. He did not force me or overwhelm me. Instead, he gently revealed to me that pride can prevent a person from recognizing what has been standing before them all along. The following morning, I arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. My fellow judges soon joined me, but something had changed in each of us. The confident conversations that normally filled our meeting room had disappeared. Judge Farid finally broke the silence by admitting that he had barely slept after the hearing. Judge Suleiman quietly confessed that he could not stop thinking about Hannah's willingness to forgive people who misunderstood her. Even Judge Nabel, who is known for hiding every emotion, admitted that the hearing had unsettled him in ways he could not explain. None of us argued. None of us mocked the conversation. We simply sat there, each carrying questions we had never expected a 12-year-old girl to awaken. At that moment, I realized that what had happened in the courtroom had not ended when the gavel struck. The real hearing had only begun, and it was now taking place inside our hearts instead of inside a courtroom. As I looked out the courthouse window, watching people begin another ordinary day, I understood that my life had reached a turning point. I could continue protecting my pride, pretending nothing had changed, or I could honestly seek the truth wherever it led. That decision filled me with both fear and hope, because I knew it would affect everything I believed, everything I valued, and every judgment I would make from that day forward. I did not yet have all the answers, but for the first time in many years, I found myself sincerely asking God to reveal the truth to me and to remove every trace of pride that had blinded my heart for so long. Little did I know that only a few days later, an unexpected meeting outside the courthouse would completely transform my life and bring me face to face with the same young girl whose quiet faith had already begun changing me from the inside out. 3 days after the hearing, I left the courthouse later than usual. The city streets were busy with people returning home from work, children laughing as they hurried through the marketplace, and vendors calling out to passing customers. My mind, however, was far away from the noise around me. I had spent every spare moment replaying the courtroom in my thoughts, trying to understand why one young girl's quiet faith had shaken convictions that had stood unchallenged for decades. As I approached the courthouse gate, I noticed a familiar figure sitting quietly on a wooden bench across the street. It was Hannah holding the same worn Bible in her lap, while her grandmother spoke with a nearby shopkeeper. For a moment, I considered walking away. Part of me feared another conversation, because I knew she would unknowingly force me to face questions I was still trying to avoid. Yet something stronger than my hesitation urged me to cross the street. When I reached the bench, Hannah looked up, recognized me immediately, and smiled with the same kindness she had shown in the courtroom. There was no sign of bitterness, no trace of resentment, even though I had been one of the judges questioning her so intensely only days earlier. That simple smile made me feel more uncomfortable than any accusation ever could. I greeted her politely and asked if I could sit beside her. She nodded without hesitation. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The sounds of the marketplace filled the silence between us until I finally admitted that I could not stop thinking about what had happened during the hearing. I expected her to remind me of the difficult questions I had asked, or perhaps challenge my beliefs again. Instead, she simply listened. After I finished speaking, she quietly explained that sometimes God begins working in a person's heart long before they recognize it themselves. She said she believed the Lord had been patient with her during difficult seasons of fear, and because of that, she wanted to show the same patience to others. She told me that she had continued praying for all 4 judges every evening since the hearing had ended, because she believed God cared about each of us far more than we realized. Hearing those words face to face affected me even more deeply than hearing them inside the courtroom. It was impossible to accuse her of pretending. Her compassion was genuine, and I could see it in the way she spoke, the way she listened, and even in the peaceful expression on her face. Just then her grandmother, Margaret Williams, returned carrying a small paper bag filled with freshly baked bread from the nearby market. Hannah introduced us warmly, and before I could politely excuse myself, Mrs. Williams invited me to join them for tea at their modest home on Cedar Lane. Under normal circumstances, I would have declined immediately. A respected judge visiting the home of someone whose case had recently been before the court would have seemed unusual. Yet something inside me urged me not to walk away. Later that afternoon, I found myself sitting in their small dining room surrounded by simple furniture, family photographs, and an atmosphere of peace that was difficult to describe. Their home contained none of the wealth or status that many people spend their lives chasing, yet it was filled with genuine warmth. Before the meal began, they quietly bowed their heads in prayer. No one tried to impress me, no one pressured me. They simply thanked God for his provision and asked him to guide every person seeking the truth. As they prayed, I felt a strange mixture of conviction and longing growing inside me. I realized that despite all my professional success, my own home had rarely known such peace. After the meal, Mrs. Williams shared stories of how God had remained faithful through years of hardship after losing her husband and later raising Hannah alone following a tragic family accident. She spoke honestly about seasons of grief, unanswered questions, and financial struggles, yet every difficult memory pointed back to God's sustaining grace rather than personal achievement. Hannah listened quietly, occasionally smiling as her grandmother recalled moments when they had trusted God despite having almost nothing. Their faith was not built upon easy circumstances or perfect lives. It had been shaped through suffering, perseverance, forgiveness, and hope. As I listened, I found many of my old assumptions quietly collapsing. For years, I had believed that faith was simply an emotional comfort for people facing hardship. But what I witnessed in that little home was something much deeper. It was a confidence that remained steady even when life offered no guarantees. In that moment, I sensed that God was gently revealing to me that truth is often seen most clearly through lives transformed by his love rather than through arguments alone. When I finally stood to leave, Hannah walked with me to the front gate. Before saying goodbye, she looked at me with sincere concern and quietly said she hoped I would never be afraid to seek the truth wherever God might lead me. She explained that following God had never made her life easier, but it had filled her life with hope that could not be taken away by fear or opposition. Those words stayed with me as I slowly drove home through the evening streets. For the first time in my life, I no longer felt satisfied merely defending what I had always believed. Instead, I found myself genuinely seeking the God whose love had become so visible through the lives of a grandmother and her 12-year-old granddaughter. I did not yet realize it, but that visit had prepared my heart for an experience only a few nights away, one that would forever remove every remaining doubt and completely transform the course of my life. Several nights after visiting Hannah and her grandmother, I found myself sitting alone in my study once again. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the rest of the house remained completely silent. The Bible that had collected dust on my shelf for years now rested open on my desk, its pages marked with small notes I had begun writing in the margins. I could no longer deny that something was changing inside me. The pride that had once made me feel strong now felt like a heavy burden I had carried for far too long. As I prayed for the first time with complete honesty, I did not know the right words to say. I simply asked God to reveal the truth to me and to remove anything that had kept my heart from recognizing Him. As I remained there in silence, an overwhelming sense of peace slowly filled the room. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced through success, education, or professional achievement. Deep within my heart, I sensed the Lord gently revealing to me that He had never stopped pursuing me, even during the years when I refused to seek Him. Instead of condemning me for my pride, He was inviting me to know His mercy. Tears began running down my face before I even realized I was crying, and for the first time since I was a young boy, I knelt beside my chair and surrendered my life completely to God. The following morning, I woke with a peace that words can hardly describe. The questions that had troubled me for weeks had not all disappeared, but the fear surrounding them was gone. As I drove toward the courthouse, the city looked strangely different, though nothing around me had actually changed. The people walking along the sidewalks, the crowded buses, the street vendors opening their shops, all of it seemed precious in a way I had never noticed before. When I entered my office, Judge Farrar immediately looked at me and quietly asked if I had finally slept well. I smiled for the first time in many days and admitted that something remarkable had happened the night before. He studied my face for a long moment before confessing that he had been experiencing the same restless search since the hearing. Without planning it, the two of us spent nearly an hour speaking honestly about our doubts, our pride, and the unexpected impact Hannah's quiet faith had made on our lives. It was the most sincere conversation we had shared in all the years we had worked together. A few days later, I asked Hannah and her grandmother if they would meet with the 4 judges outside the courtroom. They agreed without hesitation. We gathered in a small community hall not far from Cedar Lane, where sunlight poured through the windows and children could be heard playing outside. This time there were no court officers, no reporters, and no legal documents spread across polished desks. There were only 6 ordinary people sitting together, speaking openly about faith, forgiveness, and the search for truth. I surprised everyone, including myself, by apologizing for the pride with which I had approached the hearing. Hannah immediately smiled and assured me that she had never hated us. She explained that she believed God had been working in all our hearts long before any of us realized it. Her grandmother gently reminded us that God's mercy reaches people from every background when they sincerely seek Him. As she spoke, I realized that the greatest miracle I had witnessed was not a dramatic sign or an extraordinary event. It was watching hardened hearts slowly become willing to listen. Over the months that followed, my life began changing in ways both large and small. My family noticed that I had become more patient and quicker to forgive. Colleagues at the courthouse remarked that I listened more carefully before making decisions and treated everyone who entered my courtroom with greater compassion, regardless of their background or beliefs. I developed a habit of beginning each morning by reading scripture and asking God for wisdom before hearing even the simplest case. There were still difficult days, and I certainly was not a perfect man, but I no longer relied on my own understanding alone. The Lord continued teaching me humility, reminding me that true justice is never separated from mercy. Looking back, I often smiled at the unexpected way He chose to begin that work, not through a famous preacher or a powerful public event, but through the faithful testimony of a 12-year-old girl who quietly refused to deny the one she loved. Whenever people ask me today what changed my life, they usually expect me to describe a brilliant argument or an undeniable miracle. Instead, I tell them about Hannah Williams, the child who walked into a courtroom alone, yet never truly stood alone. Her courage forced me to examine my own heart, her kindness overcame my prejudice, and her unwavering trust in God pointed me toward a truth I had spent years refusing to consider. I now understand that God often works through the people the world least expects, using humble lives to reach hearts that seem impossible to change. My story is living proof that no one is beyond His reach, and that even the proudest heart can be transformed when it finally becomes willing to listen. What I did not know then was that this journey would eventually give me opportunities to encourage countless others to seek God with sincerity, and that is the message I now share wherever I go. Months passed, but the memory of that courtroom never faded. Every time I entered the courthouse, I remembered the frightened 12-year-old girl who had stood before 4 experienced judges with nothing except her faith and a worn Bible. Word slowly spread throughout Dar al-Hayat that something had changed in me. Lawyers who had known me for years noticed that I was no longer impatient with people who struggled to explain themselves. Court staff quietly spoke about the difference in my attitude. Even my family commented that I smiled more often than I used to. At first, I avoided explaining why. I was still learning, still growing, and still trying to understand everything God was doing in my life. But the more I reflected on His goodness, the more impossible it became to remain silent. I realized that if Hannah had found the courage to stand before 4 judges without denying her faith, then surely I could find the courage to tell others how God had transformed my own heart. The very testimony I once tried to challenge had now become part of my own story, and I knew I could no longer hide it. Not long afterward, I was invited to speak at a legal conference attended by judges, lawyers, professors, and law students from several neighboring cities. The organizers expected me to deliver a lecture on ethics and fairness in the justice system, subjects I had spoken about many times before. As I stood behind the podium and looked across the crowded hall, I felt the familiar temptation to give my usual speech and avoid mentioning the change God had brought into my life. But as I paused, I sensed the Lord gently reminding me that truth should never be hidden out of fear. Instead of delivering the prepared lecture, I began telling the audience about the courtroom hearing that had changed everything. I described my pride, my confidence, my determination to prove a young girl wrong, and the unexpected kindness that shattered every assumption I had carried for decades. The room became completely silent. Some people leaned forward in surprise, while others simply listened without moving. When I finished speaking, no one applauded immediately. Instead, many remained seated in thoughtful silence, as though they too were examining their own hearts. After the conference ended, several young law students approached me with questions. One admitted that he had spent years believing faith and intelligence could never exist together. Another confessed that he had become so focused on building a successful career that he had neglected his relationship with God. An elderly professor quietly thanked me for having the courage to speak honestly rather than protecting my reputation. Their conversations reminded me of my own journey. None of them were looking for arguments. They were searching for hope, purpose, and truth. I found myself encouraging them to seek God sincerely, to read His Word with open hearts, and never to allow pride to prevent them from following wherever the truth might lead. As I drove home that evening, I thanked God for using my greatest moment, off-bride, as the beginning of my greatest testimony. Only He could take a courtroom filled with conflict and turn it into the starting point of so many changed lives. One afternoon, I returned to Cedar Lane to visit Hannah and her grandmother once again. Hannah was now a little older, but the quiet joy in her eyes remained exactly the same. As we sat together over tea, I shared how God had been opening doors for me to encourage others. She smiled warmly and said she had continued praying that the Lord would use each of us to point people toward Him. Her grandmother reminded me that true faith is not measured by how loudly we speak, but by how faithfully we live each day. Those simple words stayed with me long after I left their home. I understood then that the greatest sermons are often preached through ordinary lives filled with love, humility, forgiveness, and unwavering trust in God. Hannah had never tried to become famous. She had simply chosen to remain faithful, and through that faithfulness, God had reached people far beyond what any of us could have imagined. Today, whenever I remember the day 4 judges believed they would easily silence one young Christian girl, I cannot help but smile. We entered that courtroom convinced we already possessed all the answers, but we left carrying questions that only God could answer. I often tell people that the loudest voice in that courtroom was not spoken through anger or authority. It was spoken through quiet faith, humble love, and unwavering trust in the Lord. Those qualities changed my life forever. If there is one lesson I have learned, it is that God can use anyone who is willing to trust Him completely, regardless of age, status, or position. A frightened 12-year-old girl became the instrument God used to transform the heart of an experienced judge. And every day since then, I have thanked Him for the mercy that found me when I least expected it. Years have now passed since that unforgettable day in the courtroom, and every time I sit behind the judge's bench, I remember how close I came to missing the greatest lesson of my life. Many people still recognize me as the judge who once questioned a 12-year-old Christian girl, but I no longer feel ashamed to speak about it. Instead, I thank God for allowing that moment to happen. Had I continued living with the same pride that once controlled my heart, I might have earned the respect of many people while remaining empty inside. Today, I understand that success, education, and influence cannot give a person the peace that only God can provide. Looking back, I can clearly see that the Lord had been patiently working in my life long before I noticed Him. He used conversations, memories, unexpected friendships, and finally, the quiet courage of a child to break through the walls I had spent decades building around my heart. What I once considered an embarrassing courtroom hearing became the greatest turning point of my entire life. Not long ago, I received an invitation to attend the graduation ceremony of Hannah Williams. She was no longer the frightened 12-year-old girl who had stood before us holding a worn Bible. She had grown into a wise and compassionate young woman who continued serving her community with the same humility that had amazed me years earlier. After the ceremony, she introduced me to several young students who had heard my testimony. One of them smiled and said, "Judge Hassan, your story helped me stop pretending to have all the answers and start seeking God for myself." Hearing those words brought tears to my eyes because they reminded me that God never wastes a surrendered life. Hannah had no idea that her faith would reach so many people, and neither did I yet. The Lord had taken one ordinary courtroom hearing and turned it into a testimony that continued touching lives long after the case itself had been forgotten. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how differently I now viewed the people who entered my courtroom each day. Years earlier, I often saw only legal cases, evidence, and arguments. Now I also saw fathers carrying hidden burdens, mothers praying for their children, young people searching for direction, and elderly men and women hoping someone would treat them with dignity. I had learned that every person standing before a judge has a story that cannot always be found in official documents. That realization changed the way I listened, the way I spoke, and even the way I prayed before making difficult decisions. I regularly asked the Lord to give me wisdom, fairness, and compassion, knowing that true justice is strongest when it is guided by humility rather than pride. My profession remained the same, but my heart had been completely transformed. From time to time, people ask whether I regret the questions I asked Hannah during that hearing. I always answer honestly. Yes, I regret the pride behind many of those questions, but I also recognize that God used even my mistakes for His purpose. Had I never challenged her faith, I might never have witnessed the grace with which she responded. Had she answered with anger, I probably would have dismissed her words and continued living exactly as before. Instead, her kindness became the mirror that revealed the condition of my own heart. I now understand that believers often speak most powerfully when they respond to opposition with patience, love, and unwavering trust in God. That lesson has stayed with me every single day since then, and I pray I never forget it. As I share this testimony with you today, I do so with deep gratitude rather than pride. I am not the hero of this story. Hannah is not the hero either. The true hero is the God who patiently pursues people even when they resist Him, who softens hearts that seem impossible to change, and who can use the faith of one obedient child to transform the life of an experienced judge. If my story encourages even one person to stop running from God and begin sincerely seeking Him, then every painful question, every sleepless night, and every difficult moment along this journey will have been worthwhile. And as my testimony draws to its close, there is one final message I want to leave with every believer, a message I wish someone had helped me understand many years earlier. As I bring my testimony to an end, I often think back to that morning when I confidently walked into the courtroom believing I was the one who would test another person's faith. I had no idea that before the day was over, my own heart would be placed under examination. Looking back now, I can clearly see that God was working long before I recognized His hand. He was patient when I was proud. He was merciful when I was stubborn. He did not abandon me because I doubted Him. Instead, He continued drawing me closer until I finally became willing to listen. If you have followed my story from the beginning until this moment, I hope you understand that no person is too educated, too successful, too respected, or too far away for God to reach. I was living proof, that a heart can appear strong on the outside while quietly longing for the peace that only the Lord can give. The day I surrendered my life to Him was not the end of my journey. It was the beginning of a new life filled with hope, purpose, and a joy that no courtroom, no title, and no earthly achievement could ever provide. To every believer watching or listening today, I want to encourage you from the depth of my heart never to become discouraged when people misunderstand your faith or question your commitment to Christ. I learned through Hannah that faith does not always speak with loud words. Sometimes it is revealed through quiet obedience, gentle kindness, patient endurance, and genuine love for those who oppose you. The world may admire power, influence, and clever arguments, but God often works through humble people who simply choose to trust Him each day. Do not think your prayers are unnoticed because answers seem delayed. Do not believe your acts of kindness are wasted because no one applauds them. Continue walking faithfully with God even when the road becomes lonely. Continue showing love when others choose hatred. Continue forgiving when it would be easier to seek revenge. You may never fully know how the Lord is using your faith to touch lives around you, just as Hannah never imagined that her quiet courage would completely transform the life of one of the judges who questioned her. I also want to encourage every Christian to remain deeply rooted in God's Word. Throughout my years on the bench, I discovered that human opinions change, cultures change, and circumstances change, but the truth of God remains faithful. Make time every day to read the Scriptures with an open heart. Do not treat the Bible as a book that gathers dust on a shelf as I once did. Treasure it, study it, allow it to shape your thoughts, your decisions, and your character. Spend time in prayer even when you do not know what words to say. The Lord hears sincere hearts. He reveals wisdom to those who seek Him humbly. Stay close to fellow believers who will encourage you to remain faithful and never allow pride to convince you that you no longer need God's guidance. The closer I have walked with Him, the more I have realized how much I still need His grace every single day. Before I leave you, I want to remind you of something that changed my life forever. Love one another. The kindness Hannah showed me accomplished what arguments never could. Her willingness to pray for those who opposed her became the very reason I began searching for God with sincerity. Imagine how different our families, our churches, our communities, and even our nations would be if believers chose love instead of bitterness, forgiveness instead of resentment, humility instead of pride, and prayer instead of endless conflict. The world already has enough anger. It desperately needs followers of Christ who reflect His compassion in both their words and their actions. Let people see Jesus through the way you speak, the way you serve, the way you forgive, and the way you continue trusting Him during difficult seasons. Your life may become the testimony God uses to change someone else's heart, just as one faithful child became the testimony that changed mine. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this testimony. If there is one truth I hope remains with you after this story, it is this: never underestimate what God can do through one life that is fully surrendered to Him. Whether you are young or old, wealthy or poor, educated or still learning, God can use your faithfulness in ways you may never see in this lifetime. So keep following Christ with all your heart. Love one another sincerely. Pray without giving up. Study God's Word faithfully. Walk in humility. Trust Him even when you cannot see the outcome. And whenever you face opposition because of your faith, remember that the Lord is able to use even the hardest moments for His glory and for the good of those who love Him. May God strengthen you, guide you, protect you, and fill your heart with His peace as you continue your journey with Him until the very end. Amen.